Welcome, listeners, wherever you are. Today, we'd like to continue our series of podcasts that introduce Dr. Tom Barnett, the author of a new book called America's New Map, Restoring Our Global Leadership in an Era of Climate Change and Demographic Collapse. I am Rich Suttie, a longtime colleague of Tom's, and it's my privilege to moderate today's chat with Tom. America's New Map is due to be released later this summer and is somewhat of a sequel and a continuation of Tom's earlier New York Times best-selling books, The Pentagon's New Map, which was followed by Blueprint for Action. There, Tom introduced us to new ways of thinking through America's grand strategy post 9/11 and how a systems view framed by the dynamics of globalization across all of the areas of economic, security, social, information, intelligence, and demographic forces could be better understood. These were shaped, and Tom introduced us to new rule sets and statecraft, hopefully leading to a better future. Well, in this latest book, America's New Map, Tom continues this grand strategic thinking with what I think are unique viewpoints saturated with positive economic determinism and social changes that comprise America's grand strategic choices today. This session follows two previous sessions that introduced Tom, his background, a summary, and a canvas of those books. We also introduced two of the through lines, which in the book represent major strategic themes. These were entitled Frankenstein's Monster Coming to Grips with Our Most Powerful Creation and Destiny's Child, How Demographics Determine Globalization, Winners, Losers, and the Future. Today, we'll be focusing on another through line, Superpower Brand Wars. The global middle seeks protection from the future. This will get us into superpower competition, the major actors, the primary forces, and the prescriptions for a brighter future. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you very much, Rich.
I'm looking forward to this. As you know, I mean, this was the emphasis that my background and most of my career has been immersed in. And I've enjoyed everything because I enjoy the systems view. I enjoy the analytic. I enjoy the framework. I enjoy the way it all comes together as it needs to come together and can't be piecemeal. But here we go. Superpower Brand Wars, through line number 4 in your book. And here you say that the Middle Earth, and you can define that for us, is facing climate change's worst ravages. It's also home to the South's burgeoning middle class. And I think this was a key beginning to this through line. You state winning the global middle defines superpower competition this century. Help introduce these terms for us again of Middle Earth and the middle class and how this is all coming together.
Well, Middle Earth is the concept of the lower latitudes where we're going to see the most profound climate change impacts. So think of a band equatorially centric going from 30 degrees north to 30 degrees south of that equator. So the lower latitudes, subtropics, in that band, you're locating more than half of humanity and the bulk of future global middle class consumption. So I like to describe the situation as one of being an irresistible force, climate change, coming to this part of the world and all these people, and bumping up against an immovable object, which is the demand for a better life, non-negotiable, by the emergent majority global middle class. When you think about the middle class, it's different from the poor or the rich. The poor tend to want protection from their circumstances. The rich tend to want, frankly, protection from the poor. But what the middle class wants is the hardest thing to deliver. It wants protection from the future. It wants protection from uncertainty. It has a good life. Often after generations upon generations of poverty, it's achieved a better life. It's moved into that middle class, and it wants a sense of security as to its future and to its ability to pass along that accumulated wealth and standing and status to subsequent generations. So when you think about the emergence of a middle class in the West at the beginning of the 20th century, you got two strong ideological responses to that emergent middle. and its desire for self-rule. You got a response from the left, Bolshevism, a desire to prevent the rise of the so-called bourgeoisie. And then you got a response from the right, fascism, Nazism, that sought to protect the shopkeepers of that middle class from the property appropriating desires of the radical left. So both the left and the right sought to control the middle, and that got us a conflict, World War II, and a huge amount of destruction across the first half of the 20th century. America was smart enough to thread that needle and remain middle-class centric in its political structure. And that is a lesson we tried to impart upon the world after World War II, when we sought to spread our rule sets for modern globalization. I'm arguing in this book that if you think about the rise of the global majority middle class, we're in effect rerunning that experiment that led to all that violence in Europe first half of the 20th century. And if you look around, we're seeing the same arguments for authoritarianism from the left and the right. We're even calling them the same names.
Yeah.
And we're using these names in our own internal dialogue here in the United States. Democrats calling Republicans fascists, Republicans calling Democrats socialists.
Right.
It's this sense of a rerun of something that last time, while it worked for us, led to enormous conflict. And my concern is when you put all that demand and desire in this large swath of humanity located in this middle, and they're coming under climate change, then that kind of tells me that the superpower competition for the allegiance of that global majority middle class is going to have a lot to do with which superpower navigates all the impact of climate change upon the southern populations of that Middle Earth band directly to their south. So if you think about it, America has to be concerned about Latin America. Europe has to be concerned about Africa, the Middle East. Russia, China have to be concerned about Southeast Asia.
Yeah. And so this idea, this major theme that the middle class fears the future, and now we have this globalization with its fiercely, as you call them, fiercely competitive forces. And it's particularly challenging for this middle class. You state that politics, both domestic and international, naturally then become a competition to see where models of governance most effectively reduce the uncertainty for the middle class and the fear it generates.
Right.
And that is the competition. And that's, I'll just be honest, is what is read as I am and looking at different things, that's not being discussed today in these frameworks. It has been far more binary, which we'll get into, in terms of haves and have-nots and power plays and power struggles in a very old Westphalian sense of borders and the like.
Let me jump in there because that's a cool observation. I'm arguing at the same time that we're having a very similar, relative to globalization, microcosmic discussion of the same issue regarding America's middle class. So everybody's concerned about the shrinking middle class, the threatened middle class. And when that middle class feels threatened about its future, you get things like the Tea Party movement. You get things like Make America Great Again. You get a lot of fear and uncertainty. And I think that's the tie-in here that's really the kind of core thrust of the book is relating what's going on inside America, this concern about the future of the middle class, with what's going on inside the world, which I would argue globalization writ large is all about that emergent global middle class.
For you, and I got it, it's more than analogy. This is actually directly related. You actually state the fundamental question then for us to face is which of the superpowers will be most ready, willing, and able to meet the immense global challenges, and which will be derailed, as you're mentioning now, along the way by its internal strife, costly wars, and too many climate disasters on a one-by-one basis. When it comes in, here, I love this because it refers to actually the cover of your book. When it comes to flags and stars will be added or lost in the decades ahead based on the decisions we make.
It's hard to imagine the superpowers as currently constructed going through the next 2, 3, 4 decades of immense challenge unfolding across Middle Earth, and the responses they're going to be forced into making, and the adaptations they will be forced into undertaking. It's hard to imagine those superpowers existing in the same form as they do today. I just think the evolutionary response is going to have to be much more profound than that, much like it is for plants and species and animals around the planet. They're being forced, by scientists' estimate, into evolution at a speed that's something like 10,000 times the norm. I think political entities are going to be forced by climate change to evolve and to adapt at a factor many times over what we're typically used to enduring. And, and the political science, by definition, that's a revolution.
Yeah. Yeah, I see that. One of the coolest parts of this through line, and though I would never recommend someone even attempt to deconstruct the book in any way, because it is so fused and interconnected. But I could see teaching a class on this as an educator and having it be rich unto itself, and that is sort of your SWOT analysis. You actually go through a very interesting, and again, I don't see it other places in terms of how you, look at strengths and weaknesses, but you actually take us through a very concise view of the superpower current strength and weaknesses as framed by the globalization, these major forces. In America, you say our historic strength is in brand recognition and sheer likability, which then, as a weakness, is currently being damaged by our all-consuming demographic journey. Your quote, to a white majority minority status. So there's America, and then help us as you contrast that with the other superpowers. You handle it almost in a single paragraph, and yet I would love to unpack them in a full semester-long course. But let me just introduce these, and then together we'll go through how they work together or don't work together in terms of the superpowers themselves. So for America, you have our greatest historic strength in our brand recognition, our sheer likability, as you say, and then a weakness that corresponds. It's being damaged today by an all-consuming, your words, demographic journey to white majority minority status. And then you bring up on the heels of that the EU's strength as one of the superpowers, as its superb, since World War II, particularly, model of member integration, though you bring forward the weakness of its inability to process the Muslim states. Comment there before we move to China, India, and Russia.
Well, if you think about, the difference between America and Europe in the post-World War II era and specifically in the post-Cold War era, there has been this sense that America's association with globalization means to globalize is to Americanize. And that's raised a lot of calls and accusations about America's cultural imperialism. What's interesting to me is that slow and steady, the EU has expanded its membership from the original half dozen or so up to now 27 members, with 10 in the pipeline for future membership. And they avowedly say in their accession process that we're here to Europeanize your state, your nation, to bring it up to kind of our cultural, legal standards. And on that basis, we'll allow you membership into our union. No one calls that a negative process. It's an aspirational process. And I just am taken by the notion that to Europeanize is considered a very positive thing as part of accession to the EU. But when you talk about Americanization, that's usually tossed off as kind of a cultural imperialism and a negative development. And that tells me that Europe has cracked the code on political integration going forward in this century, and America hasn't done so yet. And that is odd, because if you think about it, we added a star every 3 to 4 years for the first 17 decades of our nation's existence. So it's a skill set that we have. We've just forgotten about it. And if we can get over our own sense of anxiety or guilt or whatever regarding the Americanization like transformation that comes to a lot of places when they globalize their states and their economies and their societies, I think we come to realize that we can play in that venue too. We can offer membership and accession, and we can grow our brand just like the Europeans are.
Yeah. And I've always seen it as a mathematical sine wave of sorts, but it matters under which globalization era that sine wave peaks and valleys. And here we are today with this one. You move on to China's strength as its economic success in building and maintaining its middle class. So right to the sweet spot of what is appealing today to much of the rest of the world. However, its weakness is the non-replicability of that growth model and, of course, blatant authoritarianism. Comment on China's strengths and weaknesses?
I think, there are moral consequences to that kind of economic success. I mean, that brings a lot of happiness. That brings a lot of stability and sense of security to the middle of your social and economic system. It hasn't, inside of China as of yet, moved it in the direction that we would prefer, which is political pluralism. But you have to understand, from the perspective of global South nations, they are deeply impressed with the success there. And they see a lot of moral authority, quite frankly, in China and its leadership for being able to deliver that much wealth creation and that much poverty reduction. Now, we look at it and say, well, they're not a democracy, so they can't have any moral authority. But that's us kind of narrowly restricting that sort of moral authority just to the political aspects of its system without recognizing the incredible success in the economic realm of its system. And we have to understand that most places in the world are much more interested in achieving that sort of material success first before attempting or worrying about or making any sort of effort towards the kind of political pluralism that we demand up front, which, really is unsustainable in places that don't have a stable and functioning and happy middle class.
It's not that all that stuff doesn't matter. It's just the sequence.
It's Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Right.
You're going to take care of the basics before you can ask for the kind of self-actualization that comes about through middle class rule of its own future in a pluralistic democratic system. Functioning democracies are not easy. If they were, everybody would have one, because they're obviously desirable. And,
Right.
America didn't have a fully function, I could argue, a political democracy until the civil rights era, the mid-1960s. So, we took our sweet time getting there for major chunks of our own population as well.
Yeah. And then you move to India, equally as challenging to profile, but you summarize their strength in India as its rise in the service-centric economy that, as you say, conscientiously decarbonizes its energy profile at the same time, which gives us this immense opportunity as the demographics unfold. However, threatened by climate change, which then heads right into a major Achilles heel of the agricultural sector and its employment, its workforce, and its ability to transition that. Comments on India?
Well, India is constantly fascinating, and it's really the in the same way that China marketizing in the 80s took us from the so-called West or free world economy, and then we started talking about a global economy, then ultimately globalization. So China joining the marketized world was a huge tipping point in globalization's advance. The next one even bigger on many levels because the demographic dividend is that much larger, will be India. And, the tipping point here is crucial because they have the capacity, if they can hold their democracy together, and there's been plenty of backsliding in the last few years, they hold the promise of showing that you can replicate the kind of rise that China did without necessarily being an authoritarian government. The trick they face is that, in the old battle between Jefferson and Hamilton, do we go agrarian, Jeffersonian, or do we go urban industrial, Hamiltonian? Deng was able to turn China on that dime rather quickly in the 1980s because it was an autocratic system. With India, they have long embraced the Jeffersonian sort of ideal to remain, in terms of their workforce, overwhelmingly agriculturally centric. It's still about 45% of their workforce works in agriculture. Those are numbers you haven't seen in America for 150 years.
Right.
Sort of concentration. And they have, in many ways, under the Gandhi system, kind of reified the village over the city. So, I mean, and there's always that tension between the idyllic rural and the sinful city. So they're asking for a lot of social change on a very rapid basis, while their own agricultural sector, because of their geographic proximity to the equator, especially in their southern regions, obviously, is going to be under some enormous stress. So there's a question about not just can they deal with this demographic dividend of about 500 million workers, put them all to good use in a service sector and in light manufacturing, which is the way most countries embrace their demographic dividend to start a rapid industrialization that allows them to move up the production chain. But they're also going to have to process the cityward flow of a large number of people who are going to leave rural areas in response to the difficulty that they will encounter in trying to make agriculture work as climate change hits Africa or India fairly seriously over the next 2 to 3 decades. So they're under a lot of pressure, not just to take advantage of a demographic dividend, but simultaneously to engineer a mass movement of their population from rural to urban. Up until now, China's success there has been the biggest internal migration in human history. It's going to be met and superseded by India's. And the huge question is, can you do that as a democracy, or do you need to kind of towards authoritarianism to achieve a level of social control and social cohesion that allows you to withstand all that tumult in a fairly short historic time frame of often just 10 to 15 to 20 years.
Before we get to how these are all can or ought to work together, despite weaknesses and strengths, we have Russia. And of course, Russia probably in a relative sense is the weakest of all, with one exception perhaps, that regarding climate change and the dynamics around climate change with human migration and resources, etc. Okay, so fine, Russia is in the north. It has this climate change advantage. It's not in Middle Earth per se, but now we have depopulation in Russia, and we have Russia stepping all over itself.
Right.
And as you point out, and I thought this was the best line, Russia is more prey than predator so long as Putin rules. Brief comment on Russia and its posture.
Well, Russia, as a result of the rather brutal invasion and war with Ukraine, is finding itself hurtling towards kind of economic vassal status with regard to the Chinese. You think about Russia, it's the biggest exporter of natural resources in the world. You think about China, it's the biggest importer of natural resources in the world. So for Putin to go into Ukraine and find himself deglobalized as far as the West is concerned, that's a huge windfall for the Chinese and to a certain extent the Indians, because they're buying Russian natural resources at bargain basement prices.
Yeah.
So that's a huge sort of capture going on right now that goes on as long as this Ukrainian thing proceeds, you could say that's a good development. It sort of neuters Russia's superpower status to a certain extent over time. But, the wounded bear, the wounded animal argument's always there, and we are talking about nuclear weapons. So that's a pretty dicey road to go down. It does offer the potential, though. If you think about it, Russia is vastly underpopulated. That's always been the problem in the Russian Empire. Huge territory, underpopulated. So they've always had to make deals with sort of tribal powers along its rim to be able to kind of control its coherence. And that is a trade-off dynamic that we've seen them engage in the past, or like when they sold Alaska to us. And it's been a source of potential encroachment by powers along its rimlands throughout history. And I think it's going to be very much subject to those sorts of disintegrating pressures in the future. If you think about a Russian state that's weakened by this Ukrainian adventure and goes into some sort of state failure funk following Putin's ultimate demise, I don't think it's inconceivable, and you could tell the Russians are thinking this because they're sending out signals right now about it, that the West and the East in combination will look upon Russia as sort of the sick man of Eurasia and contemplate its deconstruction.
Right.
To a European Russia and a Far East Russia and sort of a Central Asia Russia that could come under the economic sway of the EU and China and India, respectively. Think about it. The EU and NATO have kind of gobbled up the near abroad that was Eastern Europe, the Soviet bloc states. Historically, China has been a major threat to Russia in the Far East. And if you think about China and India generally, they're going to suffer tremendous agricultural losses with regard to climate change in their southern regions. And they're going to be naturally looking to kind of migrate their control northward to take advantage of new opening up of arable land, most of it which will be concentrated in places like Kazakhstan and Russia. So I think Russia's in a desperate situation now with the combination of demographic collapse, the low population density, not enough people really to take advantage of what climate change will do to it. And I think it'll make it a target for, frankly, dismemberment.
Right.
For really profound accommodation of external powers kind of ruling its rimlands more than it's able to do so itself. And that, again, is the fundamental flaw of the Russian Empire going back hundreds of years.
Yeah, and you finish this up by with a wrap up of this thread, and you state that the five superpowers, whether they realize it or not, which is always a fascinating thing in itself, are already engaged in a competition to invent, propagate, and secure those north-south lines of social networking, security cooperation, economic integration, and political consolidation, as opposed to the traditional East-West. And this as a derivative of the climate change and immigration and movements of peoples in the middle class and the expanding and shrinking and thereof, which moves us to, and it's a great introduction to your thread 19, which is titled, "It's Not Personal, It's Strictly Business. Superpowers Compete to Revise Global Rules." And I just want to kind of wrap up today, and it's not really a wrap up, but it's focus on this area in a couple ways, and then we will wrap up. But as superpowers compete to revise global rules, you state that America's challenge now is dealing with the success of the grand strategy previous, particularly the rise of competing powers, and who's going to, with these strengths and weaknesses, this introduction of the five major powers, how is this all best to work together in your optimistic way of dealing with future grand strategies? We know how it can conflict. Okay, a lot of people spend a lot of time on how it conflict. You spend a lot of time throughout the rest of this through line, how can they work together given the drivers of globalization as you've emphasized them? You say that these superpower efforts to rewrite the rule book constitute neither an immediate or direct threat to our current international structure in America, so America has an opportunity. So how introduce how we might be able to see the superpowers work together as opposed to conflict together.
Well, you think about the international system as structure and norms. And the structure tends to be the institutions, things like the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, and the norms tend to be the rules. And America really set about transforming both of those aspects of the international order after the Second World War. And we were enormously successful, primarily because our version of mini globalization, the West, outperformed dramatically in an economic sense the Soviet bloc's version of a mini globalization. And once the success of ours relative to theirs became apparent with Deng Xiaoping's decision to marketize communist China, well, the conflict was really over. I mean, that was the death blow to the Soviet system. They aren't the future. And when you're not the future, you can't hold that sort of promise and attraction in terms of the international system. Right now, our grip, our presumed grip on the future, America represents the future, that sense, is not as strong as it used to be. In part because internally we've turned on ourselves and we want to make ourselves great again. We're trying to replicate the 1950s and we're reaching back for all sorts of social conservatism that speak to previous ages and, to a certain extent don't jive well with where the world is going. We're moving in different directions. We're having a traditionalist response, which, countries can do when they embrace globalization profoundly. They can retract into these kind of nationalistic, social conservative stances where they want to pull back and kind of slow things down. We're seeing that with Viktor Orban's regime in Hungary, with Erdogan in Turkey. Putin has basically done that, and Trump represented that instinct in America. But when you do that sort of reach back to the past and past greatness and addressing past grievances, you lose your sense, your attractiveness to the rest of the world as representing the future. And I think America has long held that sort of status, and it's absolutely crucial to us. It's not an abstract, esoteric thing. When you represent the future, people will buy your sovereign debt. Okay. Right. And when you don't represent the future, they're not interested in paying for in structuring and financing your debt. So that's where China is right now. They're on the cusp of that sort of representation. They're capturing a lot of what we used to call the third world, what we now call the global south, what is largely concentrated in my definition of Middle Earth. They're capturing a lot of allegiance because they are seen as, if not the future of political freedom, they're certainly seen as the future of economic development and freedom. And when you look at Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, when they get together, they don't talk about trying to overcome the West or lead the West to the same degree they optimistically talk about trying to attract the allegiance and to become leaders of the global South. And India has this sort of ambition as well. And, I think that's, in historical terms, that's good. I mean, we should all be interested in winning the allegiance of the global South because that's the global middle class where it's located. That's where all this change is going to happen in terms of climate change. But in the West, Europe and the United States, we're not really focused on that global South dynamic or trying to win those allegiances in the same way that these rising powers are. Now, right. You could say that's because it's natural for them to go for the undecided vote, so to speak. But whatever the case, it's much more applicable and responsive to the global dynamics and cues that we're seeing with climate change and the rise of that middle class. So we're out of tune right now, America is, in terms of that struggle. They are not. They are much more aggressively recruiting these allegiances, and you're seeing it in terms of the profound global South indifference to the whole Russia versus Ukraine thing, which baffles a lot of us in the West. But looked at from the South's perspective, that's just not a fight they're interested in. They've been told throughout history that the North can't help the South, bring about some sort of new, more equitable international economic order because the North is too busy in its East-West conflicts. So, right now, when there's all sorts of things going on in the global South in terms of this emergent global middle class onset of climate change, they're not interested in picking sides over Russia and Ukraine. And they find Europe and the United States sort of out of it to be spending that much time trying to rally those forces when they feel like they've got an agenda set that's much more profound and much more consequential to themselves, and which frankly is met with greater applicability and response from the sort of things that Russia and China are willing to do in the global South, which America deems itself, not interested in pursuing.
Well, that's a great point, Tom. And as you kind of finish up this thread, you state that China offers any nation in this world something far better than America ever could: personal security through steady economic progress, and social order, however brutally, evasively, and arbitrarily enforced. And then you ask really the tease that is going to comprise the rest of the book. You ask, how does America beat that package? Comment as we wrap up?
Yes. Joe Biden's got this bit that's very self-deprecating. He always says, don't compare me to the Almighty, compare me to the other guy. And what he's really saying is, I'm not here trying to provide perfection. I'm trying to do a better job than my competition. And that's the way we should look at China and how they're outperforming us. They are nowhere near perfection. They are nowhere near the ideal, but they are outperforming us in the global South right now by offering a better and more useful and more applicable and more near-term in its application than what America tends to offer. I think America can offer a better package. I think we have a tendency to demand all sorts of social and economic change without offering much of a carrot to go along with that. So what China offers is the ability to get into global value chains, to hook up to 5G networks. And what they ask in response to that is the ability to have a certain presence, certain backdoors in your cyber networks, certain capacity to come in and influence your society's development, subtly, mostly through the narrow perspective of, how you look at China and how you deal with China. So they're into manipulating you just like any other superpower, but it's mostly about preserving their sense of reputation and their sense of status in your society. And sometimes they get fairly explicit with it, like they did with that recent deal with the Solomon Islands, where they write right down into the agreement their ability to come in and on a security basis protect their interests whenever they dang well please. And that does sound fairly neo-colonial. So can we beat that package? We're going to have a hard time, America will, trying to offer a better kind of slot or integration into global value chains than China can right now because of the differences in our economic development. We're much up higher on the production ladder than China is. So China offers a sort of natural slots in global production chains that we can't match. What we can offer, though, that is superior to what China's offering in terms of security and a sense of forward progress, is that we can offer access to and ultimately membership in the best run rule set there is for a multinational integration. And that is the model of these United States, which started as 13 colonies and now has 50 members. We've gotten out of thinking of ourselves as a multinational union. We don't offer an accession track like the EU does today, but this book is arguing that we should get back to that reality and start thinking along those lines and start considering those political evolutions, because ultimately there is going to be a tremendous amount of north-south integration. And at the end of this 4 to 5 decades of turbulence created by climate change, there are going to be superpowers that are much bigger than they are today, with dozens of new members in their ranks, and there are going to be superpowers that can't do that sort of integration. I argue America is built for that sort of integration, but not the way we're behaving right now.
Yep. And as we wrap up, you leave us really in the very beginning of the very next thread as a teaser here. You share what winning looks like, and you say winning looks like in this century is where they choose you. If you must conquer a state to win, you lose the superpower brand war. But if that state seeks out affiliation, you are winning, no matter the frictions triggered. Remember, you state, allies empower you while subject nations burden you. And on that same vein, the states in the United States chose and continue to choose and are allies despite the frictions. And it's working. Lots more to discuss, way more to work through, but you're going to lead us into some real practical ways to do statecraft in a new world under these new conditions and under the frictions that globalization bring, particularly to the middle class, but across the world. Hey, thank you for everything. This has been a great session, Tom. I look forward to more when we can do them, and I look forward to the launch of the new book. Thanks again.
Thank you. And just as a last note, the Darwinian instruction is not to be the most powerful. It's to be the one most open to adaptation. That's how you survive. That's how you flourish. That's how you grow.